Blue didn't always exist, at least not in language. In some developing languages, there was no word for it, so the brain just kind of filed it under gray. And I lived most of my life with DID in exactly the same way. If you saw my last video, you'll know that something happened in May 2025 that completely changed my life. It was the moment my DID system revealed itself, just 6 weeks before my 46th birthday. And that brings up a really valid question. How does someone who spent their entire life analyzing the world, trained in science, where everything's about observation and data, trained in education, where you assess things against clear criteria, and trained in music, where your job is to live and breathe emotional nuance, how does that person live with DID for over 4 decades and not even realize it? That's what we're exploring today. The brain doesn't cope well with unlabeled experiences. It can perceive things it doesn't have words for, but it struggles to hold on to them. There's no clean place to store that kind of thing. So the brain does what it always does when it encounters something new, if it doesn't have a label for it. It files it under the closest thing that it already understands. Even if it doesn't really fit, like mistaking a tuxedo cat for a penguin. The colors are close enough, and sure, it's standing upright in about the same way, but the shape and the meandering pattern lines and the feel of it are just all wrong. And deep down, you know something's off, but without a better category, that's just where it goes. We do this all the time in everyday life. Someone hands you a weird kitchen tool, no packaging, no instructions. Your brain just won't leave it as unique mystery object. It goes, okay, it's kind of like a whisk, some kind of whiskey stirry thing, good enough. And it sits there beside the garlic crusher, and every time you see it you think, what the hell are you actually for? We even do this with emotions. You feel something rise up in your chest. It's not quite sadness, not quite love, not quite loneliness, but it's got hints of all three. You don't know what to call it, so maybe you just shrug and say, I just need to get out more. Maybe something close enough to pass, even though it's not really right. But the feeling was real, and it just got filed there because your brain had nowhere else to put it. And that's the thing. Without language, memory doesn't stick very well. Experiences with no labels tend to fade or get misfiled. Not because they weren't real, but because your brain needs some sort of linguistic framework to anchor the meaning. You see this really clearly with children learning vocabulary. The moment a toddler learns the word for dog, something amazing happens. They don't just recognize their dog, they start seeing dogs everywhere. And they also stop calling dogs cats, because the moment the label exists, the mind stops misfiling. Language helps us sort reality. Without it, things get blurry. There's a concept in linguistics called linguistic relativity. It sounds a bit abstract, but the idea is fairly simple. The language you speak shapes what you notice, what you remember, and even what you feel. And it's kind of like a map, and language draws the borders. If there's a word for something, it gets a place and a name. If there's no word, it's like a town with no name. You might pass through it, but was that really a town at all? Was it just some buildings in the middle of nowhere? One of the clearest examples comes from spatial language. In English, we use left and right, but in some Aboriginal Australian languages, those words don't exist. Instead, they use cardinal directions, north, south, east, and west, even in casual conversation. So a child might say, the cup is south of the plate. And to them, the world is the reference point, not their own body. And when researchers study this, they found something remarkable. These speakers always know which way is north. Indoors, blindfolded, without even checking. Not because they have superpowers, but because their language trains their attention to constantly track orientation. Meanwhile, an English speaker like me walks out of a shop, turns two corners, and suddenly has no idea which way they're facing, and that's linguistic relativity in action. Once your mind learns to see something, you can't unsee it. Even complex feelings make more sense when they have a name, like schadenfreude. The guilty little thrill when someone messes up. You probably felt that long before you knew the word, but until it had a name, that was funny, but should I be laughing? Without specific words, emotions get dumped into vague drawers. Sad, stressed, weird, fine. We see this in neuroscience. When new experiences enter the brain, they pass through the hippocampus, the region responsible for forming episodic memory. It doesn't store everything, and it favors experiences that are meaningful, emotionally charged, or easy to place in context. In other words, it likes a story. Psychologists have documented this for years. When we can name an experience, we're far more likely to remember it. Labeling gives the brain a hook, a place to store the moment, so it can be retrieved later with meaning, not just sensation. But here's the fascinating part. The moment a concept is named, something incredible happens. Memory rewinds. The brain just doesn't start noticing new examples, it retags old ones. Oh, that's what that was. This makes so much more sense now. So language doesn't just help describe what happened, it helps us understand what happened. Let's take everything we just explored and apply it to something deceptively simple: the color blue. If you've ever read Homer's Iliad or Odyssey, you'll notice something strange. He never describes the sea as blue. To him, it's wine dark. The sky is described in words closer to gray or bronze or something metallic. To us, it seems a little bit absurd. How can you look at the ocean and not see blue? But here's the thing. In the early stages of language development, many cultures had no word for blue at all. They could see it, their eyes worked just fine. The sky didn't just magically change color. But without a label, the brain just slotted it into the nearest available category: gray, black, dark, or whatever felt close enough. When linguists charted the emergence of color terms across the world's languages, they discovered something fascinating. Color words appear in a nearly universal sequence. First, you get light and dark, or black and white, and then you get red, probably because of blood, followed by yellow and green, most likely because of plants. And only after that, if ever, do they develop a word for blue. Even today, the Himba people of Namibia have no distinct word for blue. In visual tests, when shown a circle with one blue square among 11 green ones, they don't spot it right away. But when shown a circle of green squares with one slightly different shade of green, they detect it instantly. To them, that green boundary exists, but blue versus green? That's not a category their language carves out. It works in reverse too. In Russian, there isn't just one word for blue. There are two completely normal everyday terms, one for light blue and one for dark blue. And in reaction time studies, Russian speakers actually perceive the two as more different than English speakers do. Their brains flag that boundary faster because the language marked it. So let's be clear. Blue didn't suddenly appear when the word did. It was always there. What changed was the cognitive framework to treat it as its own thing. Without a word, the brain files the perception under the nearest label. And once enough people do that, it becomes normal not to see blue as blue. It wasn't invisible, it was just misfiled. And that is a very different kind of invisibility. Looking back, knowing what I know now about dissociation and DID, the dissociation was always there. The switches and memory gaps, sudden inexplicable shifts in tone or motivation and emotion, they were part of me long before I had a name for any of them. But without the concept of dissociation, without a framework like DID, my brain filed them into whatever categories were available. When I felt like a completely different person, I just called it a mood swing, or blamed it on stress or lack of sleep. When the whole conversation vanished from my memory, I was scatterbrained or chalked it up to ADHD or just being tired. When I felt like I wasn't real or the world around me wasn't real, I was just zoning out. In my former religious mindset, maybe it was a spiritual experience, or I just shrugged and said, I don't know, just go blank sometimes. Every dissociative episode got a label, just not the right one. And like cultures without the word blue, those experiences became invisible to me as a group, not because they weren't happening, but because they were absorbed into other meanings, even if they didn't quite sit there comfortably. Just like people who looked at the ocean and genuinely believed they were seeing a darker shade of gray, I was experiencing dissociation and genuinely believed that I was just someone with no self-control, emotionally immature, overreactive, or maybe just even a bad person. So I kept using the wrong labels, and I categorized and recategorized my experiences, trying to make them look normal, and trying to force fit them into frameworks that didn't quite hold them. Because anything was more acceptable than the terrifying thought that something about the way I experienced the world was fundamentally flawed. My first major dissociative event, at least the first one I can remember, happened when I was about 10. There was a ravine in the woods near my childhood home with a rope swing hanging from a tree. You could swing out over the stream, and I loved that thing. I was there all the time. After school, I'd go alone or with friends, and I would wander down to the riverbank and just spend lots of time down in the ravine just playing. So one afternoon, I checked the time so I know when to head back for dinner, and then I did what I always did. I climbed onto the swing and launched myself out over the water. Suddenly, I was standing on the other side of the clearing, a good 4 meters away. No transition, no climbing off, no walking, just a jump cut, like someone had taken 2 reels of film and spliced them together mid-frame. And I looked down at my watch to see how much time I had left. Nearly an hour had passed, and I panicked. Not just confusion, terror. I had no idea where the time went, no memory of leaving the swing, no awareness of how I ended up across the clearing. And you gotta remember, this is the late 80s and early 90s, and like UFO documentary shows were everywhere, and they all said the same thing. Missing time means alien abduction. So that day, I didn't experience dissociation. I experienced an alien abduction. After that, I developed a real phobia of gray alien faces. I had nightmares for years. I'd avoid books or posters or movies, anything to do with that oval face with the almond eyes. And on nights where I had to walk down the hallway in the dark to use the bathroom, I would cover my eyes like this, genuinely afraid that if I looked, there would be an alien standing there ready to take me away again. What it actually was, it was a dissociative fugue. It was a rupture in awareness so deep that my brain just kept going without me. Nearly an hour of my life happened in that gap, even if that life was just me staring into space. I have no way of knowing what I was actually doing. But none of that made it into memory. It was just gone. But I didn't have the concept of dissociation at 10 years old. No understanding of how trauma fragments memory, no language for amnesia or identity disruption. So my brain did what all brains do with unrecognizable experience. It forced-filed it. And at age 10, the only label I had for missing time was alien abduction. Even though it happened in broad daylight on a sunny Florida afternoon, it became a misfiled memory, locked behind a label I didn't have the language to challenge. And it wasn't that the experience didn't happen, it just got filed under the wrong color. To me, that moment was just black. Before I continue, I just want to give a gentle content warning. The next section includes a brief discussion of self-harm linked to dissociation. If that's something you're not in a place to hear right now, please skip ahead to the timestamp on the screen. At university, I had a friend who played the bass. It was one of those easy friendships that just clicked, and then one day, we weren't friends anymore. I have no memory of how things deteriorated. One moment everything was fine, and the next, it's like I'd suddenly become a stranger to him, and he was very angry with me. That rupture triggered a pattern that I can now recognize. Two alters reacting to each other over the situation around him. At the time, it felt like I was just losing control of my own behavior. And here's what was actually happening. Leo, my protector/persecutor, would front just long enough to send razor-sharp, emotionally loaded emails. And I would remember the sensation of typing them. It felt like I was in some sort of trance state, but I wouldn't remember what the words were the next day. I'd have to go and reread everything that I had sent. And then I was really embarrassed about what it said. And then my other protector alter, Zero, would just slam forward, panicked and desperate to repair this connection. His whole logic is, if I can just apologize right, it will stop hurting. And me, the Chris identity, was trapped between them. I was trying to avoid him, letting the situation cool off. I'd try to distract myself, make rational promises like, I'm not going to go near him, and still I found myself going back to him all the time. Every time I tried to fix it, I only made things worse. Because it wasn't me fixing it, it was Leo escalating the problem, and then it was Zero suddenly flipping to the other end of the spectrum and begging for forgiveness and trying to repair everything. And then it was me waking up in the shame of the fallout. I wasn't able to explain my own behavior. And here's the thing about Zero. If someone can leave, he goes straight into fawn mode. I can fix this. Please let me fix this. Just don't go. But when he detects no path to repair, he doesn't retreat. He chooses annihilation to stop the pain. That's when I'd find myself in high-risk situations, tempting fate to end my life. And I was still inside watching it happen. I was conscious of what was happening, but completely powerless and absolutely terrified by my own actions. I took myself to the emergency room of the nearest hospital and I told the doctor, I don't want to hurt myself, but I'm afraid I'm going to do it anyway. And I know that sounds contradictory, but unless you understand dissociation, I didn't want to die, but Zero did. And what I called it at the time, I'm too intense, I get fixated, I'm emotionally immature, I have no self-control, I'm self-destructive, and I must be a bad person. What it actually was, Leo escalating that conflict to maintain control of the story, Zero desperately trying to repair it, and Leo blocking that repair with more manipulation, and then Zero realizing that the reconciliation wasn't possible, and choosing erasure as the only escape from the pain. And Zero still doesn't fully understand that if he annihilates himself, he annihilates all of us, which is why he's the only alter that I genuinely fear. But back then, I didn't have words like alter, fronting, ego dystonic compulsion, fawn response, protectors and persecutors. So I did what I'd always done. I force-filed it under the only label available, emotional meltdown. Just another shade of gray. So let's jump forward to 2009. In my late 20s, I moved to the UK to be with my long-distance partner. He used to call me his forever bear. That didn't last. After the breakup, we were still living in the same house, while I scrambled to figure out where I was going to go next. My emotional stability was already shattered. Then one evening, I woke from a nap. I looked in the mirror, and something was wrong. Not, I look tired, not, I hate my face today. Wrong like the person looking back wasn't me. It felt like someone else was behind my eyes, looking through me, and I could feel its awareness. There was a distinct otherness to it. It wasn't malevolent or anything, it was just foreign. And the strangest part, I had the sense that it was trying to understand itself as much as I was trying to understand it. I stood there for at least 30 minutes, speaking to my own reflection like it was a stranger. You're not me. Who are you? Who's behind my eyes? And because at the time I was reading books about occult practices, I just filed it under demonic presence. Then the next day, as the brain does, I tried to reclassify it again into something a little less bizarre. Probably just breakup stress, overactive imagination. I'm reading too many weird books. And, what did I call it at the time? A demon in the mirror? Or, I don't know, just stress. What was actually happening? That was a dissociative depersonalization with an alter close to the front. One that I now know as SFA, or single female alter, because she is, as far as I know, the only female alter in my system. And yeah, I named her after single female lawyer from Futurama. She was just kind of hovering right behind having executive control. She was present enough that I could feel her, but not present enough for me to recognize her as me, but not me. Without words like alter, co-fronting, ego state, derealization, I did what the brain had to do. I threw it in my lifelong weird but whatever box. Just another shade of gray that didn't quite fit in. One of the clearest examples of dissociation I have from a professional setting happened when I applied for a promotion. Everyone, even the management, assumed that I would get it. The other managers like, you're a shoo-in for this, you've definitely got it, and it would be a huge surprise if you didn't get it. But then it went to a colleague instead, and I called her on Teams to congratulate her. And then, whoosh, I remember making the call, I remember speaking, I remember hearing her speak, but it was like seeing through frosted glass and hearing both our voices through like padded walls or something. It was muffled and distant and distorted. It was like I was there, but not really. And I was present, but I couldn't catch a single word of what was going on. And the next morning I woke in a panic. I knew I had been rude, but I couldn't remember how I was rude. So I called her again first thing the Monday morning, again to apologize, and I blamed it on pain medication, which in fairness I was on at the time, but it had never affected my personality or memory like that. I had been using pain medication for months for various inflammatory things that I'd been going through with skin, a lot of nerve damage and things, and nothing like that had ever happened in the months I was using that medication. So it was about a year later that I had discovered my DID, and then I kind of came out to her because she is now my manager. And I asked her about that call because I explained what happened with Leo, which we will get into later in this video. And then I said that you've actually met him before in this call. So I asked her what that call was like, and she said it was kind of awkward, almost interrogative. Like I was asking questions like why she got the promotion with this like passive-aggressive teenage stroppiness. So that wasn't me, that was Leo, my former persecutor alter. He has a strong sense of narrative justice, and in his mind, that promotion was part of my story. And when the story got disrupted, he stepped in to find out why. And this wasn't the first time. After I told her about the DID and all that, she had realized that she had spoken to Leo before in a conversation years earlier that I have no memory at all of, and it was really embarrassing. And yeah, so what did I call it at the time? It was a reaction to too much coding. What it actually was, a switch, an alter stepping forward with his own logic, his own tone, emotional spectrum, and body language. But without the word alter, I had nowhere to file it, so I dropped it in the only box I had. Yet another gray moment that didn't match the color of the day. So, looking back, some dissociative experiences were easy to miss because I had no label for them at all, but others were even harder to spot because they did have labels. They were just hiding inside of everyday language. In English, we have a lot of idioms that people just use every day, like, I'm not myself today, I was beside myself, I was miles away. Part of me wanted to stay, but part of me wanted to go. Or I felt like a kid again. And I say those things too, but here's the thing. When I say them, I mean them. When I say I felt like a kid again, I don't mean that like in a nostalgic Christmas movie kind of way. I mean, I felt like I was 7 years old in a grown man's body. My arms felt too big. My fingers felt unfamiliar. I got giddy and overexcited about Christmas candy, and the joy wasn't just emotional, it was fully embodied. That I was that child again, fully and viscerally. But I didn't question it because the idiom made that feel like it was normal. And I was like, well, everyone says that. Everyone feels like a kid again sometimes. So I assumed that people were saying they also experienced what I was experiencing. So I had no way of knowing that my literal interpretation didn't match their metaphorical one. But I now know that it was Nico-fronting. A shift in age, perspective, embodiment wasn't a metaphor. And so many dissociative experiences just kind of pass under the radar that way because the language made it sound ordinary. So I never realized just how extraordinary it actually was. By this point in my life, I had a long catalog of weird, unplaceable experiences. Switches that I didn't know were switches, memory gaps I couldn't explain, emotional reactions that felt foreign, like they belonged to someone else wearing my face. And I always assumed the problem was me. I was just too intense, too reactive, too weird, too broken. So I built an identity for myself around that, an emotionally complicated person who meant well but just kept messing up. I didn't have any other framework. And then, in May 2025, that changed. Not metaphorically, not gradually, literally overnight. One day, I was a man who had never considered having a rare and severe mental health condition. The next, I was waking up in the middle of the night, full panic, crying in the dark, whispering, "There's someone else in here." I just want to give a gentle content warning again. This next section contains references to self-harm. So if that's difficult for you, please feel free to skip to the timestamp on the screen. I didn't know it then, but that moment, that fracture, was the first time my system truly revealed itself. Until then, I always found a way to mislabel or rationalize or hide from what was happening in my mind. But this time, the cracks were too wide to ignore. It started with a sudden, uncharacteristic outburst of anger at like 3 in the morning. I woke up with this overwhelming urge to demand control over a shared creative project with one of my partners, Ian. No build-up, no rumination, just a burning compulsion to act. So, first thing in the morning, I messaged him at work because we work in the same place, and what followed was a blur. I don't remember much of that call at all. I was told I was condescending, cold, even a bit cruel. And I believe it because I may not recall the words, but I believe what Ian tells me. After that, whole days vanished. I have almost no recollection of a Wednesday or a Thursday or most of Friday ever even happening. What I do remember is the emotional whiplash. I would be angry and combative in one moment, and then I'd be just utterly collapsed in shame the next. And I remember saying, "Stop making me say words, they're always the wrong ones." And I meant it. It felt like something else was speaking through me, and I was just trapped behind glass, only surfacing long enough to beg him to stop talking to me because I couldn't stop myself from responding, and I had no control over what was happening. Later that week, something in me shifted again. I sat down to write Ian a letter, and I felt like a snap. It was like my control was forcibly taken by something that just had malice flowing through its blood. I remember turning to my husband and I said things that were so against my personal beliefs and my values. I remember turning to him, just over there, and I just said, I'm gonna hurt him like he hurt me. And then I just turned back and I kept writing, piloted just by pure spite. I don't remember what I wrote, and I still don't. After I sent it, Ian and I argued over text, and then there was another switch, and this time I went completely flat, clinical, no emotions accessible at all. And he was like, could this be interpreted this way? Yes. Could that be interpreted that way? Yes. Just absolutely flat. And then he wanted to end the conversation there. He just said, you're shutting down. And then, snap, another alter switch, and I turned instantly to despair. Not sadness, but obliteration energy. And Zero had come and fronted again. And at that point, I reached for what remained of a bottle of morphine on my desk and drank all of it. Not because I wanted to die, but because that part of me did. And it wasn't attention seeking, and it wasn't even a decision. It was the culmination of a week where I wasn't alone in my body, and I hadn't realized it just yet. And a few minutes later, my husband said something that cut through the dissociative trance. I looked around the room. I was disoriented, confused, and I just burst into tears. And I said, I don't know what I'm doing, but I can't make it stop. And that was the moment that I knew I wasn't alone in my head. In the days that followed, even more memories of that week just evaporated. I was left with fragments, emotional residue, secondhand reports of the things that I had said and done. I felt possessed, not metaphorically, but actually used by something inside me that I didn't understand. I couldn't believe the words that people said I'd written. It didn't sound like me, and I felt absolutely sick with shame. And was absolutely terrified that it could happen again. That week in May was the moment I stopped saying, I'm just intense, or I just overreact. That's the point where I finally said, what the hell is actually wrong with me? The weeks after that moment were a haze of confusion, existential terror, and obsessive research. I did not trust myself, my memories, my thoughts, even my own body. How could I? I just watched it move and speak and act without my permission. I couldn't even trust that my thoughts were coming from me. And I was desperate to understand what had happened. What the fuck is wrong with me? I didn't feel crazy in like the stereotypical way. I didn't feel delusional. I felt possessed. But I also knew it wasn't supernatural, it had to be psychological. So I kept asking, if this was psychosis, would I even be able to ask this question about myself? So I kept researching. Mood disorders, no, bad fit. Bipolar, some overlap, but not enough. Borderline personality disorder, possible, but that doesn't explain the missing time and the amnesia. And nothing accounted for how I could act with such conviction and clarity in the moment and then forget it entirely. Eventually I found the term Dissociative Identity Disorder, and I dismissed it instantly. That's the multiple personality thing. That can't be me. These people just black out dramatically and suddenly have different names and accents. That's nothing like this. But something in me just wouldn't let that go. The more I read, the more I found people like me, not the dramatic Hollywood versions, but the quiet ones. People who talk about the missing time, emotional whiplash, or parts of themselves that seem to act with different values and tones and logic. And I stopped feeling extreme, and it all sounded really, really familiar. I booked an emergency appointment with an online UK psychiatry service, and I was given a diagnosis of DDNOS, or dissociative disorder not otherwise specified, which I later found out didn't even exist anymore because it was replaced in 1994 by OSDD, or otherwise specified dissociative disorder. So the diagnosing psychiatrist was clearly a little bit out of date with his DSM-5. So it was a placeholder, at least. A way of saying something dissociative is happening to me, but we don't know what. So that wasn't enough. I didn't need a shrug and a label from a detached psychiatrist who told me that dissociation was just people avoiding responsibility. That only made me feel worse, like I had somehow chosen my way into a severe mental health disorder. I didn't need someone to dismiss me. I needed language and a framework and a lens to understand what was happening to me. And then I discovered the Pottergate Center. They specialize in dissociative disorders, and they use the structured clinical interview called the SCID-D, which is basically the gold standard for diagnosing these kind of conditions. And I knew instantly that's what I needed. An expert, a proper diagnostic tool. Someone who could help me make sense of what was going on. So while I was waiting for that to happen, I did what I always do, and I continued to research. I read psychology books, and I watched videos, and I reached out to people who identified as multiple, and I started learning the language. Fronting, switching, alters, amnesia barriers, ego states, blending, structural dissociation. Each new word was like turning up the saturation on a world that I'd only ever seen in grayscale. Suddenly, things made sense. It wasn't just being intense, it wasn't just being erratic, it wasn't me being weak. I was dissociating. And I had been doing that most of my life without even realizing it. That was the moment that I stopped seeing black and gray and finally started seeing blue. Once the Pottergate Center diagnosed me with dissociative identity disorder, I learned more about structural dissociation, and it was like, for the first time I was reading a map, one that actually matched the terrain of my life. And I learned that dissociative disorders aren't defined by just one strange symptom, they're defined by a specific combination of 5. Amnesia, gaps in the memory for actions, conversations, depersonalization, feeling detached from your own body, derealization, feeling like the world around you isn't real, identity confusion, not really knowing who you are, and identity alteration, where another part will take over your thoughts and behaviors and speech. Once I had those boxes, I started sorting. I went back through my life and I re-examined everything I had once dismissed as weird but whatever, and I realized that every single one of them slotted neatly into one or more of those categories. Missing time on the rope swing, amnesia. The obsessive meltdown at university, identity confusion, and identity alteration. The mirror incident in 2009, depersonalization, identity confusion, identity alteration. The job promotion call that I can't remember, identity alteration and amnesia. One by one, that mental junk drawer I'd been filling for decades, all of these moments that never made sense, started sorting themselves into place. I didn't suddenly develop DID at age 45. It was always there. I just didn't have the framework to recognize it. But once I had language, real language, names and concepts and lenses to look through, the fog began to lift, and for the first time in my life I could say, I know what this is. I know what I am. My mind didn't split in May. It was already split. I just didn't know it. For decades, I lived as a system without a name, and the parts within me didn't think of themselves as separate. They thought they were me. They thought they had to be me because they didn't know any other way to exist. Because none of us had ever learned about structural dissociation, so none of the parts within me could understand that. They all wore the mask of Chris, not to deceive anyone, because they never considered that they would be separate. So yeah, today you'll hear me use names like Leo or Zero or Nico, and it might feel new. It might sound like something's changed, but what's changed isn't their presence. What's changed is that I finally know what they are. Distinct tracks of consciousness in one brain, each with its own thoughts, feelings, and wants. Distinct from each other, but shaped by our life experiences. They've stopped acting like background processes, and they've started stepping forward as co-authors of a life that we share together. And that's not a breakdown. That's integration in process. It's like learning a new color exists, and suddenly you start seeing it everywhere. Not because it appeared out of nowhere, it was always there. It was hiding in plain sight, just waiting for a label. So for anyone struggling with understanding a friend or loved one that has DID, know this. We've always been this way. We've always been this multiple, fragmented mind, shaped this way by what we lived through. We just didn't have the words to describe it, but now we do. We can finally talk about it and make sense of it. And most importantly, we can finally heal. Because once something has a name, it has a place. And once it has a place, it has a path forward. This isn't the end of my story. This is the moment I finally started to tell it in full color.